Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome and thanks for coming. This is one of the best workshops you'll attend in this series. I'm Mary Marshall Clark, and I'm director of the Columbia Center for Oral History Research, and with Amy Starecheski, co-director of the Oral History Master's Program, formed in 2008. This is a Paul Lazarsfeld series of oral history and public workshops. This is a very special moment for me to be able to introduce Amy and her incredible book. Amy is always a person most of you know from being around her, whether it's a thesis, an essay, or an oral history project. She asks, why does it matter? Who cares? So it's my great pleasure tonight to introduce Amy, a longtime colleague, ally, and friend of all things oral history, and friend and family, and try to say why ours to lose matters. For those of you who are watching this online, Amy Starecheski has been working with the Center for Oral History Research, I believe since 1999. Oh my gosh, almost 20 years.
Yeah?
20 years.
It'll be 20 years in the fall.
Oh my goodness. So she has been a leader in the field of oral history since about a year from when she came to the Center for Oral History. And so we really have the great pleasure of helping to build and shape and think about the field of oral history together, which is just a very rare pleasure. And so that's just been wonderful. She directed all of our programs of education and outreach, including our Summer Institute, for many years. And she was an incredible interviewer, so much so that after September 11th happened, I was standing in the shower one morning and realized we need a young person. By then she had gone on to do something else. And I said, wait, I've got to call Amy and see if she'll come back and help us. And she became the lead interviewer for our project of gathering together 900 hours of interview. And she also led an education effort in the public schools and after schools called the Telling Lives Oral History Project and Curriculum. And she and Jerry Alvarelli wrote that curriculum, which became a great success and a model for public community-based oral history. To me, the three pertinent questions that all good and great oral history projects, oral history books, and videos and films ask that unite oral history as a field are, who am I? Who are you? And lastly, but not least, who are we? So who am I and who are you are what we call intersubjectivity, and who are we means that oral history must always be public, something that Amy is a very, very stern voice on and very helpful in that way for all of you and for me, reminding us never to sit nicely and loosely and comfortably within the big bubble of Columbia University, but think who is going to read this, who is going to see this, who is going to listen to this, and what actions can be taken as a result of this. And that what actions can be taken as a result of it is, I think, what distinguishes the who are we that's so important in this book. I think through answering that question, who are we, in this book, Amy has provided what I think is the very best model of published oral history I've seen. Being able to define who are we in intimate, local, and global terms simultaneously. Who am I? Amy is a part of the group, the collective, the squatters, who began, the first riveting chapter of this book is her own journey as a squatter and what she did and how much money she lived on. And I knew Amy at that time, and I never knew anything about what she was doing really or what she was living on. So it just was kind of a wonderful and amazing story. But by claiming herself as a part of her project of asking who are we, that's taking a level of authority and being transparent in a way that we rarely see in the field of oral history. So she unites the personal, the political, the cultural, the intersubjective, and the collective. These are very important issues, and especially today, as we face into the Trump administration, to place oral history in a theoretical and practical and justice-centered mode of defining and consistently asking who are we in relation to the body politic. It seems to me as an older person that Marxism has gone out the door, that we don't have much of a class analysis. I keep telling my students this, we need to read Marx again. But Amy has never stopped thinking about politics and what it means to live well and to create one's own space and to stand for what beliefs she believes in, and this I think is the consistent brilliance of this book. It addresses how we might go about belonging to each other in a time of failed capitalism. The model of claiming and saving urban spaces that Amy records in this marvelous and highly readable book is a model that challenges the commercialization of space to the exclusion of developing human community in a more collective and empathic sense. I can't think of a book that better epitomizes oral history at its very best, or one that is more urgent to read now.
Yay! Thank you so much, Mary Marshall, for that really generous and helpful introduction. I think it's a rare introduction that, as you were talking, helped me to understand what I wanted to say and why even better. And I really appreciate that. And it's been really an honor to work with you for 20 years. So, as a former squatter, new PhD student in cultural anthropology, I started doing fieldwork on the Lower East Side with a group of former squatters because I wanted to understand how people value and make successful claims on urban space, especially to understand the relationship between legal property rights and value, and to understand the intangible things that make a place valuable in both monetary and intangible senses. So I was living in a building that had almost 50 apartments in it and was mostly empty, and I wanted to know, how can such an obviously useful space become economically worthless? What is the relationship between use value and exchange value, to bring out some of that Marxist terminology that I still love so much and find so useful? And how can, by the time the building was ending as a squat, how can basically one person control an entire building when there are so many people around that need housing? And so I decided, in order to better understand these questions, to follow a group of squatters in the Lower East Side as their buildings were turned into legal co-ops. And I'll talk more about the details of that process in a little bit. As an oral historian, I assumed that part of my research would be doing some oral history with this group of people, and I was really pleasantly surprised to find that I was late to the game. So by the time I got to the Lower East Side and started this research in 2009, there was already a group of squatters that had gotten a documentary heritage grant from New York State, had started an oral history project, commissioned someone to do interviews, archived the interviews at NYU. They had collected some of their papers into an archive, also at NYU. And I found quickly that these were only a few of a very broad range of history-making activities that were happening in the neighborhood. There were people doing, in the neighborhood and beyond, but using this history. There were people doing slideshows and storytelling performances, showing pictures from the old days. Teaching workshops about how to squat to young people. There was an art show in the gallery of Bullet Space, which was the first building to complete the legalization process in 2009, called The Perfect Crime, celebrating that they had gotten away with it and actually claimed and now owned this building. This is some tarry roofing tools stuck to a piece of plywood and put on the wall as art. This is a collection of now obsolete handmade wood-burning stoves that had no use once they had central heating. There was a museum, the Museum of Reclaimed Urban Spaces, opening in the storefront of C-Squat, which is one of the buildings I was studying. This museum started because the people who founded it realized that a number of changes in policy in New York City, the legalization of the squats, the protection of community gardens, the creation of the amazing network of bike lanes that many of us now enjoy, that had been the product of long and difficult campaigns of direct action activism, were now being remembered as nice gifts from a progressive city government that had just decided to do the right thing. This whole history of struggle was really being erased. These are people who had participated in the NYU archiving project and felt frustrated with how slow that sort of formalized university-based history-making process was to change public narratives. And so they decided to make their own museum. They got a lease on the storefront in one of the buildings that was legalizing. They started collecting artifacts. They curated them. Here they are making a gigantic mosaic sign with Jim the Mosaic Man, who, if anyone's ever been on the Lower East Side, you've seen the mosaics on the lampposts. This is a guy who does them. The sign was so big and heavy that it would have torn the whole front of the building off, so they never got to put it up. And here you can see how they preserved one of the graffiti walls in this room. This is a room that had been the sort of unofficial living room of C-Squat until it was leased to the museum. Can you guys see the pictures well enough, or should I turn more lights off? Okay. As part of the opening of the Museum of Reclaimed Urban Spaces, people were leading walking tours, even going inside the apartments of people who lived in the legalizing squats. And this is one really unusual apartment where the walls are made of translucent plastic that's lit from behind. The whole ceiling is mirrored, and it's a tiny studio that feels very large and futuristic. And one person that I got to know particularly well, Fly Orr, was doing a really wide and amazing array of history-making projects. So here she is with her clapper for her Peeps project. Peeps is both a noun and a verb. You can peeps someone. Here she is peepsing Stanley Cohen, who is one of the lawyers for the squatters. And the final result of this is a videotaped oral history interview. But Fly also draws the person while she's interviewing them. And then in the final stages of the interview, she writes down what they're saying as they say it. So this is dictation, and fills in the space around them. And she's done, definitely dozens, possibly hundreds of these. If you go to visit Fly's archive now, though, you'll find that it's both growing and depleted. Growing because Fly is constantly documenting to this day. I finally, after over 5 years, 6 years of working with her, got to sit down and record her oral history this spring and summer. Every time I was interviewing her, she was drawing me. And it was actually really helpful because she did the same thing she does in Peeps, where she put the words in at the very end. So she would have the very last thing I was saying to her to remind me where we wanted to pick up in the next session of the interview. So we did 5 sessions. I have 5 of these. And depleted because in the early 2000s, soon after the legalization deal, Fly brought the first 6 boxes of her archives to Booklyn, which is a nonprofit. Part of what they do is help artists to sell their papers and their archives to museums or libraries that might want to buy them. Why was Fly selling her precious archives? Well, she needed the money. As the buildings were legalizing, people needed to pay more monthly for their housing than they had when they were squats. Most people had paid something as squatters. They had to pay more as co-op owners. And a lot of people, like Fly, were artists or did part-time work and were activists, and didn't really have a structure in place in their lives to make a lot of money. And so trying to sell these archives was one way for her to handle that dilemma. And you can see here some of the cataloging going on. So part of my field work was actually sitting with her as she went through this process. So oral history really became not just my methodology, but my object of inquiry. And I wanted to know, why were people doing this? Did it have anything to do with the legalization process that I had come to the Lower East Side to observe? We see that very clearly with this story about Fly, right? She became a homeowner, she had to sell her archives to pay her rent. There are other much more complicated and nuanced ways that that connection is made, and that's what I want to talk about tonight. So Fly didn't make this collection to sell it, obviously. She made it for a couple of different reasons, and I want to start off the oral history part tonight by playing a clip of an interview that I did with her about her history making and why she does it.
Yeah, well, the whole concept for a squatter museum and squatter history, I kind of had that idea even way back in the day because I was always documenting, and I always I'm kind of naturally a documentarian. I always have been, probably because I moved around so much when I was growing up, and so I always wanted evidence of my existence. Because I'd be in a new place and be like, am I really here? And also just the idea of legitimacy. This is a legitimate life that I'm leading. I want to prove it. Now we have these buildings and there's if we all moved out and other people moved in, you know, what are they have no emotional connection to this building. I am like, my blood is in this building, you know, and it's like, it's such an intense thing to work so hard and fight so hard for your space. It's not just about the physical space. It's about being in control of your living space, your living, you know, not just the space, but how you live and you know, who you're interacting with and who you choose as your community. It's, so many people just don't understand this. I just feel like we've created like this little oasis of amazing people and amazing spaces, and just kind of like, it's kind of like that spark of creativity, you know, that it's, or spark of inspiration. So I'm trying to kind of like, I want to get that all together and communicate it, and it's just, I see it as such a vital part of the history of this whole neighborhood. You know, if you look in the media, it's like a lot of a lot of people consider squatters just as people who go into buildings in order to take drugs. And unfortunately, there is a lot of that happens. But, you know, so I just want people to see, you know, what actually happened here from our perspective, instead of like, you know, if somebody wanted to research squatters in the Lower East Side, if they just looked in the newspapers, that would be like such an erroneous history.
Yeah. Sorry, something a little weird with the audio going in and out, but could you hear her well enough in the back? Great. So this is a great example actually of how in oral history we're not asking our narrators simply to tell us what happened to them, but to make sense of it with us. And so my whole research process in this project was dialogic, was collaborative, and a lot of the understandings that I came to that I'm going to be talking about tonight developed out of conversations with Fly. And so in this clip you hear her talk about at least 3 different reasons for doing this documentation work. One, a very personal reason, a sense that her own personhood is tied up in the history of squatting, and that to value and to validate this history is to value and to validate her. You know, am I really here? Does my story matter? We also hear a more collective reason, a sense of collective peoplehood. Both that there are now new people coming into the squats who don't share this history, and need to somehow be included in order for these communities to continue as communities rather than just as apartment buildings. As well as a sense that collectively, similarly to the way that she personally wants to feel validated, collectively they deserve to feel validated, to be respected for what they've accomplished, and not be just dismissed as a bunch of drug addicts or freeloaders. And finally, she wants to inspire a new generation of people to do this kind of work. She wants to capture and transmit this spark of inspiration that she feels existed in this moment. And in another paper that I wrote called Squatting History in the Oral History Review, I go a lot more into the potential of oral history as a way to transmit that spark, and particularly that affective connection and that those feelings that really drive social movements, oftentimes behind the scenes. So Fly's quote introduces some of these themes that we'll be coming back to. It also brings us, I think, to the need for some context and some history, right? Why would people be vilifying these good, nice, hardworking squatters? We need to go a little deeper into the history of the Lower East Side in order to understand that. And so I'm going to take a little detour before we come back to the history making to talk a little bit about the actual history. So this is a map actually that Fly drew just for the book that I love. So squatters occupied abandoned city-owned buildings on the Lower East Side, you know, probably throughout history, but in the movement that I'm talking about and in an organized a way with momentum, starting in the early to mid 80s and continuing through the 1990s. It's important that these were city-owned buildings, This is a period where the city was taking ownership of more and more buildings that were abandoned by landlords or that the taxes hadn't been paid on, and the city wasn't taking good care of them. And so it was easy for squatters to make a moral argument that these buildings were the property of the people of the city, and they were being wasted and they had a right to use them. They were, however, in conflict with other people over this space. So there were other people that wanted these vacant buildings, and these conflicts were often racialized and described in ethnic and class terms, usually to squatters' detriment. So squatters were definitely whiter and more from out of the neighborhood than the general population that was there already, although they're far more diverse than they were portrayed as in the media. And there was a moment in the early 1980s where the big coalition of housing organizations on the Lower East Side got together and convinced the city to call a moratorium on the sale of city-owned abandoned buildings on the Lower East Side. There were hundreds of them left. They realized this neighborhood is not only suffering from abandonment, it's also starting to gentrify, and as a community, we need to get control of what happens to these buildings. It took 4 years to actually make an agreement. During those 4 years, squatters took over a good number of those abandoned buildings that weren't supposed to be being developed, and so they could easily be critiqued as line jumpers, right? Other people are waiting patiently, going through the system, and they're just taking what's there. When the final deal was agreed to in 1987, it didn't take into account the squatters' buildings as occupied. It counted them as empty and sort of up for dispersal and sale and development and whatever the powers that be decided to do with them. And so squatters were sort of, at that point, really marginalized in terms of mainstream housing politics in the neighborhood. And that's another way in which they were able to be criticized, that they weren't sort of participating in the process. I want you to hear a clip. This is famous Chrome, and I'll read you her bio from the book. Famous Chrome was born in 1968 in Shreveport, Louisiana, from young working class parents. The family moved a lot, and Chrome ended up in college in Madison, Wisconsin, where she got involved with activism related to homelessness. After traveling around the United States and Mexico for a few years, she moved to New York City in 1993 with all of her dresses and bicycles and lovers, she says, working on and trying to get a space in Umbrella House, and then, she says, becoming landed at 209 East 7th Street, which is actually the building where Fly lives now. She gave birth to a daughter there, literally gave birth in the building in 1995, and lost her apartment to her daughter's father after legalization started. She's an acupuncturist, excuse me, and at the time of our interview paid $2,300 a month for a small market rate walk-up apartment on the Lower East Side. That actually seems like a bargain now, which is crazy. So I'm going to play you a clip of her describing what the buildings were like when she first got to the Lower East Side, so you can get a sense of the landscape. And this interview was actually recorded at her request in the StoryCorps booth in Lower Manhattan, so it sounds perfect. Enjoy.
Give me a sense of what your first impressions were of Umbrella, what it looked like, smelled like, felt like, sounded like.
It was 1991. Most of that whole neighborhood there were a lot of vacant lots, there were a lot of encampments. In those lots there was infrastructure there as far as like the fire hydrants were running water, there were digouts for people doing their dishes, for washing. Something I engaged with a lot, all of us did, because none of these buildings had running water, either in or out. We didn't have drains, no electricity, or very limited electricity that was pirated out of manholes or through lampposts, or there was a variety. The buildings, they were fairly newly occupied still, thus needed to appear still abandoned. So from the outside, they very much did look abandoned. They were completely blacked out. You couldn't see any source of light coming from inside. A lot of windows missing, a lot of disrepair, very visible. Very true on the inside. Also, a lot of the Umbrella House was a 6-story building, and there were stairs, but a lot of them were temporary, made out of police barricades largely, because there were a lot of police barricades around the Lower East Side at that time. And it was dark, it was cold, it was full of rubble. Some spaces had been cleared out as people were like eking out their living spaces. There were a lot of floor joists in place without floors, so you could go up 3, 4, 5 stories and see the framework for floors and where the next space should be, but you could see all the way down to the first floor. It smelled like piss most of the time because everybody used buckets, and not everybody was super great with their piss buckets. There wasn't a standard protocol, so people made a lot of that up, and some better than others. Very dusty, and also lovely, quiet, because there was no electricity in the building, which has a very different, being inside of structures without electricity feel really different than structures with electricity. A lot of the spaces for windows didn't have windows in them, so it was a lot like being outside. And at that time it was summer, and it was bright. There was vacant lots on both sides of us that were full of rubble. The building on the south side had burned, and there was still all of the burned debris there, and then just open sky, which is not the usual experience that a lot of people have, especially in Manhattan. And the building on the north side had collapsed already, and there was a back building still standing, so most of that lot was open, again, open sky, and all of the windows to the north and the south were open, just broad, open space. We had set up for showering. This was actually a couple of years later, after we had established a garden in the vacant lot on the north side. Had routed one of the gutters off the roof to be an open spout that came out about 10 feet from the edge of the building, and that created this enormous waterfall when it would rain, and that was our shower. Gorgeous, really special, and also really down and out at the same time.
I left that one to go a little bit long because I like the way you hear her kind of going deeper and deeper into the memory, and also I think she gives a good sense of what the feeling is, of that sort of spark of inspiration, of this being a really exciting time, a sense of potential, of creativity, of wide open spaces, and of course also of a neighborhood that was full and complicated and contested. So here's an example of that. This is from the New York Times. Antonio Pagan, who was their newly elected city council person, recently said, "No one should have a God-given right to public property. The infamous minority creating havoc around Tompkins Square Park are living out their revolutionary fantasies. They are white, middle-class, young people from the suburbs hiding behind the banner of helping the homeless." And this is a very typical indictment of the squatters. And so this is what Fly is trying to work against when she's producing history. But they persisted through tactics ranging from phone trees. This is a copy of their eviction watch phone tree network, to booby traps and barricades. They held on to over a dozen buildings through the 1990s. There were major evictions, and these evictions were expensive. They were embarrassing for the city often. The squatters fought back hard using tactics they had learned in large part from European squatters who really fought as if they might win. And that's part of what kept the city from doing more evictions and pushed the city towards eventually making a deal. So in 2002, even though the squatters had been hanging on for a long time, no one really imagined what the end game would be, and it was pretty surprising when this deal was announced by the city initially that they would sell 11 of the remaining squats in the Lower East Side to a nonprofit intermediary called UHAB, the Urban Homesteading Assistance Board. UHAB would take out loans on the squatters' behalf to renovate the buildings and bring them up to code. Once the buildings were legally inhabitable, they would be transferred to the people who lived in them, along with those loans, which would become mortgage debt. Squatters would become indebted homeowners. Buildings that could not be bought or sold would become limited equity, low-income co-ops. And so what that means Limited equity means that there is a cap on how much you can sell your apartment for. Low income means that there's a limit to how much a person you sell your apartment to can make. And initially, it was that they couldn't make more than 80% of the area median income, and that the apartments couldn't be sold for more than about $25,000. So this is a pretty restrictive deal. The limited equity low income co-op is a pretty interesting sort of hybrid form of public-private, individual, collective property. You own individual shares in the building rather than owning your apartment. And each individual gives up part of their property rights, their right to sell at whatever price they want, in service of a collective good of low-income housing. And so that's part of why I think this is an interesting form of property to study, because it breaks down this thing that we think of as sort of property, a single thing, into its constituent parts and lets us look at them separately. So in contrast to many collective claims on urban space, these yielded actual legal collective ownership. So people make collective claims on urban space all the time. They might march in the street. They might ask for services in a park. They might ask to have a say in land use decisions in a neighborhood. They might ask for even the creation of a land trust. But rarely do these collective claims yield collective rights. And so this gives us an opportunity to examine how these claims are translated into something that really has to be fixed in stone, right? It has to be a legal document that everyone agrees to that says, these are the rights that you have to these spaces. And the negotiations over those rights is part of what I'm going to talk about tonight. So, coming back to my main question, what does squatters becoming homeowners have to do with them producing history? I argue that it has to do with the relationships between property, personhood, and peoplehood. And this was foreshadowed a little bit in Fly's quote, right? So anthropologists see property as a social process, a relationship between persons mediated by things, right? So we often in everyday life think of property as like a thing, like this is my property, or as a legal relationship. Anthropologists think of it much more broadly. And to complicate things even more, we tend to see these persons and things as being not fixed, but actually mutable and often produced through the process of property relations. So what does that mean? It means that I'm a human being, I'm an entity standing here. I don't become a person, a social person, unless I'm in interaction with other people in a social context, right? And those cultural, social interactions are what produce my personhood. And property is a key factor in that, particularly certain forms of inalienable property. So giving someone something that has a particular meaning helps to make them into a certain kind of person. Giving a group of people a piece of property or legitimating their claims to that property can make them into a group of people that are sort of meaningful in public and can say that they legitimately are a group, right? And persons and things, to complicate things even a little bit more, often intermingle. So we imagine that people and things are bounded, that this is my water bottle and this is me. And that is often the case in our sort of everyday experience. But if you listen to how squatters talk about their relationships with their buildings, you hear that in many cases it's a little bit more complicated than that. Let's hear Fly again first.
They have no emotional connection to this building. I am like, my blood is in this building.
Here's Maggie Wrigley, who lives at Bullet Space, the building that had the gallery show.
I put blood, sweat, and tears into the place. My shoulder and my knees and my lungs are forever in this building.
So we have a cliche about this, right? I put blood, sweat, and tears into it, that when we work on something, we become enmeshed with it. She goes even further. Her shoulder, her lungs, her knees are in this building, right? That she worked so hard that her shoulder, her lungs, and her knees no longer function for her body, that she's given them up to turn this building into a home. People said things to me like, pieces of my flesh are mixed into the mortar of this building. people told me stories about burying or hiding objects that were of deep personal importance to them in the structures of their building. So one person told me about wrapping a sketchbook in plastic and burying it in the foundation of their building. Another person hid an entire wall of their apartment as it was when they were a squatter behind new drywall when they put the drywall up. So rather than, take down the art and clean things back to the brick, she just hid that there as sort of a package for history. So we see clearly that persons and things are mixed up here. And squatters intentionally, as they became homeowners, built history into their buildings and preserved history as they renovated. So here you can see a police barricade. Here, maybe we'll turn this down just for a second so you can see the pictures better. You can see a police barricade built into the door frame there, along with some distinctive glass bottle recycling art that is in a bunch of the squats. Here you can see an umbrella house. The storefronts are being turned into pretty regular businesses, but a bit of their mosaic art around the door and their namesake umbrella is up there still. This is inside Umbrella House, a piece of graffiti that's preserved as they were refinishing their walls to meet the building codes. And so my larger project asks what kinds of persons and things were produced by the property relations of squatting, by homeownership and the transition to it. And here I'm focusing in specifically on the history-making part of that, right? So assuming that persons and things are produced through property relations, we would imagine that the property relations of squatting would produce certain kinds of persons, and we could think of like the bootstrapping individual, the jackhammer wielding feminist learning how to pour concrete, the lazy, what do you call it? Like a person who's taking from society. That's also a type of person that can be produced by squatting, right? And it's not that there weren't people like that in the buildings. And the relationships of home ownership then would produce different kinds of persons, that people's actual personhood and even maybe their collective peoplehood would change as they navigated this transition in their property rights. So when squatters were becoming homeowners, they had to decide who was part of their group and what property ownership would mean to them. Their collective peoplehood was up for new negotiation. And there's a whole literature about property and peoplehood. It's often about land or about valued family heirlooms that by existing, by not being sold, by being kept and tended and passed on from one person to another, produce a group of people. And this is much clearer in the literature on indigenous land claims than it is on the literature, in the literature on urban space, right? We don't often think about urban space in these terms. And part of what I'm trying to do is bring some of that knowledge over from one field to another and see what it helps us to see. So I want to play you a few clips from the oral history so that you can hear how squatters experience this transition, particularly in terms of their peoplehood. So this is Jeff Dan. He was born around 1967 near Madison, Wisconsin. So actually I think he and Famous came to the squats together as sort of a chain migration. They knew each other. He grew up in a middle-class family. He was a punk rock teenager who loved skateboarding and moved to San Francisco to be in a band when he was 23. In 1989, he moved to New York City and into Umbrella House. He's a father of a young daughter, loves to surf in the Rockaways, and works full-time doing construction. In 2014, he was planning to sell his apartment in Umbrella House and move to Maine, and he did that actually. So I sent him his copy of the book in Maine.
The city, I think, was forced to make this, create this program, especially for us. They were probably just like, what are we going to do with these people? They won't leave. They're not going to buy the buildings. You know, they're not going to just someday show up and say, here's $1 million, we'd like to purchase our building. So they created this thing where they could, I mean, in a way it seems cool, but at the same time, I think the way they set it up for us is they're kind of like trying to set us up for failure. or at least weed out the bad seeds, you know, and get rid of the bad apples and only keep the real responsible ones who can work and make money and give them money, pay taxes. I think that's what they did. It might be a big trick, who knows? Because the way I see it, we were all just a bunch of squatters, and we didn't want those responsibilities to begin with. So how are they going to turn squatters into responsible citizens? Can they? That's like a social studies experiment that could be studied for the next thousands of years in colleges all over the world. They turned a bunch of squatters into responsible citizens, tax-paying citizens. Yes, a few of them ended up in jail, but for the most part, we were able to break them too.
So you hear him talking in terms of a transformation, right? Turning one kind of person into another kind of person, and how some people are not going to make it through that, right? A lot of people talk to me about a gentrification of the squats as this process continued. People who couldn't or wouldn't pay, sometimes were actually evicted, sometimes wandered off, sometimes left in a huff, sometimes kind of gradually were pushed out. And there definitely was, it was much harder to keep people in the buildings who were most marginal as they became homes. Oops, sorry. The next person is Erin Williams. She was born in 1979, so she's one of the youngest people I interviewed, in northern Vermont. She was raised by Back to the Landers, bored by the rural life. She came to New York City from the Montreal punk scene and moved into C-Squat in 1999. She studied archaeology at Brooklyn College and now works in publishing. She's been a fire performer for over a decade, is a black belt in the Bunjukin Martial Arts Organization, and recently got married. And so she's talking about one of the buildings that most define themselves as being like a family.
This community has always been very built on a very us against them kind of mentality. So to turn on your own is heresy. It's been very contentious, and it's been. I actually don't know how we're going to end up dealing with it in the future. It'd be an interesting thing to come back here in a few years and see what had happened. You know, frankly, I think that everything else we've sort of managed to rise to the occasion for, and this is the one thing that we may or may not end up being able to do. Because at a certain point, you just have a bank loan to pay, and if you don't pay it, then the bank doesn't fucking care that these are your friends. They just want their money, and if they don't get it, then somebody else will pay it for them. So, too bad, so sad, you lost the building. And I think that, it would be a damn shame if that happened, but it is a possibility. And I would be sad to lose some of these people are also my close friends, and it's not, but at this point I kind of feel that if you're threatening my ability to live my life, then you need to look at that as a friend also, I also feel these are my friends, and I completely understand that, there is a sense and a desire to take care of these people as though they are family. This analogy of it also is very personal for a lot of people, and I think that, you wouldn't necessarily kick your brother out of the house because he wasn't paying you rent, even if he said he was going to and that he really needs to, So, I mean, I think that is also in play here, but I think it could really be very detrimental to our survival and make.
She ends by saying, I don't want to lose my home, You hear her really in this clip going back and forth over whether these people are family that she owes her life to and will support to the very end, or whether they're friends or even enemies who are undermining the group's capacity to keep their building. If they go legal with a group of people that can't all pay their monthly dues, the whole building could get foreclosed on and they could lose the whole thing. And that's what they're facing as they make these final decisions about who's in and who's out as they approach legalization. The third clip on this that I want to play is Maggie Wrigley. This is the one whose shoulders, knees, and lungs are in bullet space. And so you'll hear the title quote from the book in here.
you know, and we have to worry about the survival of the building with the survival of everybody else. So now we're really reliant we're completely tied in with these people, for better or worse, you know, with the people in the co-op. And that's a fragile ecosystem, really, you know. And like I said, you know, two are elderly, one is sick, one's a young, poor family. So it's there's a lot of factors that, you know, it seems like everybody's always on the edge, you know. And yeah, it's a lot more of a burden, but you know, like I said, we have a security, you know. It's something that we can anticipate. When we were squatters, you know, there was a constant insecurity and a constant fear and a constant onslaught of whatever. You know, it could be anything. If your neighbor fucks up and sets fire to the place, they could kick you out. You know, if they want to evict, you know, then we go through that process. If, you know, yeah. I mean, it's a different set of worries. You know, my life's a little more stable than it was before. Now that I'm legal, so you know, I'm in a better position to sort of hold on to something that is legal, which I never could have before. But
Do you mean legal as a homeowner or legal in terms of immigration?
both. I mean, being legal now, having my green card means that. You know, I can do this. I can, you know, I am a homeowner, and it's incredible. And you know, as long as we keep our act together, then nobody can put us out. You know, and that's it. We got it. You know, it's our building. It's ours to lose, really. You know, so some buildings, you know, they're looking at, because they always refuse to pay fees, or, you know. I know there's lots of buildings where some people just would never pay and just held on through, you know, sort of their brute force or presence. And those people are, you know, they're being put into a very different situation where, you know, that's, you know, the people that live outside of the, you know, the grid, it's a huge hardship. And that's something that's been lost, really, is because, you know, the squats used to be places where, you know, everybody could find a home and everybody could survive, and, you know, you could get credit for your, you know, sweat equity, and that would be as valid as anything else. And that is no longer a criteria. Now the criteria is paying our mortgage and, you know, and keeping the paperwork together and getting, you know, the reports in and getting the, you know, the yearly meetings, you know, audited and all this stuff. And that's a very different, you know, thing. So before, you know, I mean, it was, you know, it has its own set of problems, but there's a lot of the freedom is gone, for sure.
I forgot to read her bio. Maggie Wrigley was born in 1958 in Brisbane, Australia, as you could hear. She grew up in Sydney. Her father was a chemist, her mother was a teacher. After briefly attending art school, she left Australia to go traveling and stayed in San Francisco for a year, living in a punk rock warehouse and working in a punk rock club. She intended to only visit New York City for a while in 1984, but instantly felt at home and has lived here and worked in nightclubs ever since. She came to Bullet Space, a small building with an art gallery on the ground floor, in the winter of 1987, when she and her boyfriend were about to become homeless. She still lives there today, although the boyfriend is long gone. She recently edited a book on radical communal architecture, the architecture of change, building a better world, and is working on a book about her experiences squatting. So we can hear in all of these pieces, it's clear that a pre-existing group of people doesn't usually make claims on land. Groups are produced through the process of making claims and then of actually getting land. And we see squatters navigating that process of having to make really challenging decisions as they go through that. People in making a collective land claim and, you know, drawing again from the literature on indigenous land claims can be tied together by blood, by participation, by residence, you know, that you participate in the community, that you live there, by shared heritage or cultural practices. And it's very common that heritage, which you can think of as sort of a special, almost propertized form of history, is produced through the process of making land claims. So in order to make a claim on land as a group, you often have to say, like, here is this body of things that we can show is our heritage. You might need to make kinship charts to show how you're related to each other. You might need to formalize your oral histories and bring them into court. So history making as a part of making collective claims on land is not unheard of. It just isn't usually studied in sort of an urban context like this. So it might seem that it would be clear who would get to be part of the deal, who would get spaces in the squats, but as you could hear, it really wasn't. There was contestation over individual apartments. Maybe someone had initially claimed an apartment, gone away for 10 years and left someone else to take care of it, and then decided they wanted to come back, and that first person didn't want to leave. Maybe there was a vacant apartment in a building, and one person wanted their daughter to move into it, and some other people wanted to sell it to whoever could pay the most money for it. There was contestation over future ownership, who would be able to buy these apartments in the future, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. And this question of why should they have the right to low-income housing, and what are the boundaries of that right, just persisted even after they had made an agreement to go legal. So squatters obviously couldn't use blood or ethnicity to delineate the boundaries of their collective community. In fact, their ethnicities were varied, and to the extent that many of them were white, were actually an obstacle to making a moral claim on this housing. What they had, though, was the legal tools of the limited equity low-income co-op, and they had their history and their capacity to make history. So in the absence of race and ethnicity, squatters mobilized history and culture to produce a shared public identity that they could use to legitimate their claims and bolster their community ties as the property relations that had tied them together for decades really drastically changed. And so you might expect that history making and storytelling would become less important as their property relations formalized, but in fact what I found is that the stakes just changed. And I want to explore this through one particular moment, which is the debate over resale caps. So as I mentioned, there were initially pretty strict caps over how much the apartments could be resold for. And as the culmination of the legalization process, which took a very long time, 7 years for the quickest building, over 15 years for the ones that are taking the longest. At first, 1 or 2 people, and then a significant minority of squatters living in the buildings started to argue that they should be able, that these resale caps were unreasonable, that they should be able to sell their apartments at market rate or something close to it, or at least certainly for more than $20,000. And they made this argument based on their labor and their need. So they had worked hard on these buildings, had often invested money into renovating them, and they felt that they were not being adequately compensated for that, that this wasn't a world of widely available social services, that if they gave up their housing, this is a moment of the waning welfare state, right? There's not housing available. If they gave up their housing, they couldn't get something else for $20,000. They would still be stuck there. And the people who were making these arguments invoked a very different history than the kind of history that we heard Fly starting to narrate, this history of struggle leading to low-income housing. They told a story of really a failed dream, a failed revolutionary project that goes all the way back to the earlier history of homesteading on the Lower East Side, where there was really a vision, a pretty broadly held multicultural, multi-ethnic vision of creating a neighborhood that could be self-sustaining, built on broad collective ownership of property, collective ownership of businesses, collective ownership of land that could actually sustain people through their lives. And what they ended up with was something far more piecemeal than that. They had a couple of squats, they had a couple of gardens. One thing that one of the advocates for ending the resale cap said is, there's no you-have retirement home. There's no place where people who've been housing activists for their whole lives can go to be taken care of in their old age. And so while it might seem shocking to hear squatters who've been part of a housing movement say that they think they should be able to sell their apartments at market rates, I think that their arguments need to be taken seriously. People on the other side of this argument obviously told a different story, that this was not only personal individual labor that had gone into renovating these buildings, it was collective labor done by many, many more people than just the people who were living in the buildings at the moment that the deal was signed, and that the intention of that labor inhered in those buildings, that you couldn't separate it. You couldn't make decisions about who would own and live in those buildings just based on the people who lived in them at that moment. You had to take into account this collective effort. Again, people and buildings are mixed up. Persons and things are mixed up. This labor changed those buildings and changed what could be ethically done with them. In the end, that group did prevail, although they changed the agreement pretty substantially. It wasn't really possible legally and especially politically to entirely lift the resale caps. It was hard enough for the city council to agree in a moment when there was an intense housing crisis to give 11 buildings to people who had illegally taken them for $1 each, let alone facing the specter of those same apartments appearing on the market for $1 million 1 month later, right? That's politically impossible. They did change it so that the the apartments could be sold for closer to $120,000 each rather than 20, and they could be sold to people making up to 120% of the area median income. And so this was meant to both acknowledge the labor that people had put into it and the precarious positions in which, as they aged, they found themselves, and preserve the buildings as affordable housing, although not nearly as affordable as it had been initially. And so squatters were therefore tied into a collective that was larger than themselves, those who live in and will live in the buildings. So there's a future tense there. At the same time as one particular version of their collective identity, one tied to a long and now successful fight for affordable housing, was strengthened. So as their property relations changed, we can see here how a shared public history, as this history became public through this struggle, gave them a sense of peoplehood, which shared property ownership alone did not, especially not shared alienable property ownership. So to put this in a little bit of a broader perspective, this is a mediation of a really classic tension between land as an inalienable, intangible, collectively owned thing, and as the source of alienable, tangible, individually owned wealth. So I'm drawing a little bit from the work of Marilyn Strathern here, who works in Melanesia. So in her context, what it would be is that the land is collectively owned. It can also generate yams, which can be exchanged. On the Lower East Side, the buildings are collectively owned, and part of the equity in them is collectively owned by not necessarily the community, but a population of low-income people who need housing, and part of it is individually owned. And so the deal that squatters struck represents a rebalancing of these two ways of thinking about land. And what Strathern argues is that land is always both. We often think of it as one or the other. Land is a commodity that can be freely exchanged, or it's like the site of all meaning and the source of all of the resources that give us life, right? And for many of us in many contexts, it functions both ways. And this is probably familiar to many of us in a tension that's deeply present in American homeownership ideology, right? Where the house is both the sacred, affectively loaded shelter for the family, and it's the place where we put our wealth. It's something that we speculate on, that we expect to grow in value, that we expect to be able to resell. By passing it on to our children, we're both building our family and building our collective wealth. And those things can't be taken apart, but they're often separated rhetorically when we talk about what the social goods are of homeownership and why it may or may not be important to us as a society. So limited equity co-ops are interesting in part because they're very obviously both of these things, right? So to sort of start to come to a close here, I want to come back to these bigger questions about history and ask, why would they use history of all the available tools to legitimate their claims, and particularly oral history, since this is the oral history series? And ask, what does it do socially to call one's past experiences history? So heritage, and these are just some sort of exploratory thoughts. Heritage, which is another structure they could potentially use, is usually based much more in a relationship with the state than history. I want to look at this by sort of comparing to other options that they could have possibly used to make these public narratives, these public claims. Heritage is legitimated when it's protected by the state, whether it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site or the conventions governing intangible cultural heritage, or getting a heritage grant from New York State, right? In a setting like New York City, we're a little bit more likely to talk about historic preservation than heritage. New York City doesn't have as much of a legal structure for heritage work as it does for historic preservation, and that just varies from country to country. Historic preservation is usually used to preserve buildings or streetscapes, and has been specifically criticized as a tool that does not work well to preserve cultural context, what some preservationists call storyscapes. Lower East Side is actually listed as one of the most endangered storyscapes in the United States. So history, I think, because it's not legally defined, there are certainly places where history is legally defined and defined in relationship to the state, where the National Park Service puts a plaque, and those are very interesting spaces of contestation. But history is produced also in a much broader array of contexts: universities, museums, amateur historical societies, oral history interviews, etc. And so it doesn't rely as heavily on state mediation. So, forms of history making that privilege the narration of first-person experience, like oral history, were particularly accessible and particularly powerful and effective tools for squatters to translate their past into an authoritative and usable public discourse. So what oral history allows people to do is to take their everyday stories, their experiences, and legitimate them as something that counts in public and that can be called history. It's a way to broaden access to the power of historical discourse in that way. And so, squatters were trying to create a praxis, a discursive space in which they could be collective property owners in a counter-hegemonic way. And that's not easy. And so history was a better tool for them to do that. As a group, they could frame the legalization of their buildings as limited equity, low-income co-ops as the culmination of their work, tying their claims as squatters to their status as homeowners. We'll hear two final oral history clips here. This is Maggie Wrigley again.
We were accused of everything, speculation, trying to steal these buildings, and profiteering, of wanting, just to steal stuff and get over, we were all from out of town, and nobody was local, nobody had any commitment to the neighborhood, nobody. And that's the beautiful thing about where we are today, is because we can say that we are the only people that came out of this entire history that actually meant what we said. And we said it was about affordable housing. These buildings will always be affordable housing. And, and that's everybody that fought so hard against us, all these nonprofit groups, they're flipped. Their buildings flipped. They're all market rate now, so it's like always, we really, I'm really proud, we proved that, what we were doing was, what we said and what we did was one and the same, and it took a long time to be able to say that we proved it, but, it's a fantastic thing. It's like a gift to the neighborhood.
So as an anthropologist, when I hear gift, my ears always, of course, perk up. A gift is a form of exchange in its most classical sense that ties people together. When you give someone a gift, you're building a relationship with them. And she frames the buildings as a gift to the neighborhood. She's also arguing specifically with Pagan, who we saw quoted earlier, trashing the squatters in the New York Times. He was a big advocate for public-private partnerships to develop low-income housing in the neighborhood, which did then eventually revert to the market, and that process is ongoing and is accelerating now. And so she's saying those people who said that we weren't really in this for the good, they all actually have not done what they said, and we're the only people who legitimately were trying to create low-income housing. At the same time, as we heard, some people used history to undermine this exact argument, telling stories of work and of sacrifice similar to these stories, but they culminated in a demand for individual and unencumbered ownership. And others were excluded, and their history was denied. This is Nigel Clayton. He was born in 1968 in Bridgeport, Connecticut. He was raised in a family of school teachers. He started working at a record store when he was 13. At age 20, he hitchhiked to New York City to break into the music industry. Even though he immediately became homeless, he found a home of sorts among the artists and musicians on the Lower East Side. He got connected with squatters such as Jerry the Peddler and Adam Purple by hanging out in Tompkins Square Park, crashed in many buildings, and eventually landed a spot in Dos Blocos, a racially mixed building he remembered as a multicultural utopia. When that was evicted in 1999, he moved to Serenity House, where he lived as one of the few people of color in a predominantly white building. He works as a DJ and a staff for music events. And this audio is a little rough, but I think you'll be able to hear him.
It's been 2 years and all I get is screw you. You know, this is our building, we'll do what we want to it. You either pay us or you get out. We don't care that you lived here for 15 years before us ever coming here. We don't care that you were able to make a go of it before us ever coming here. We are the new owners. We are the landlord. We decide what goes on this property. We decide what the apartment is. Your history, none of that means nothing. Pay us or get out. So in that, no. I think that the U-Hop thing is just, I was better off as a squatter. I was way better off as a squatter paying house dues. My electrical account was straight.
So this is the powerful statement. He was better off as a squatter. And he frames it in terms of not just a loss of his housing, which did eventually happen, but a loss of his personhood, a loss of his ability to exist in the world, a loss of his history. When his apartment was renovated, he never could feel comfortable there again. The space felt unfamiliar to him. It wasn't a place where he could be himself. As he lost all of the history that had tied him to this space, he felt he was turning into a different person, a person who couldn't exist in the world in the same ways that he could as a squatter. So, in closing, to return to the questions about value that I opened with, we see here the potential for private property to both tie people to places and alienate them from them. And we see the key role that history plays in articulating collective ties to a place, a collective peoplehood that relies on collective ties to property that include land both as a source of individual sustenance and as an inalienable resource that ties generations together. And it's rare to find a way to do both of those things at once in cities today. The value of the squats came in part from squatters' work, from the congealed residue of their experience, from their affective ties, and history allowed them to preserve this and to tie it into their new property relations, making an argument to limit the prices of their homes in order to preserve their value in this more intangible sense. As the squats became partially inalienable, they were relinked to squatters' collective peoplehood. So, as we all know, while history and culture can certainly be used to brand a neighborhood, to develop real estate prices, and this is something we talked about a lot in the fall in our series on oral history in the city, is it possible to do a non-commodifiable public history, particularly in gentrifying neighborhoods? History can push up real estate prices. This research shows in particular how history can be a key part of the social process of producing and stewarding inalienable community property. Thank you.